Princess Sophie of Greece. Born with royal blood, she raised a glass to Adolf Hitler. The scandalous marriage behind Prince Philip's family scandal wasn't just a dark secret Buckingham Palace tried to erase. It was a direct pact with the SS. Why did a princess willingly walk into the heart of the Nazi machine? Princess Sophie's terrifying trajectory was violently ignited by the total annihilation of her foundational world. Born in 1914 on the sun-drenched idyllic island of Corfu, Sophie's earliest days were framed by the absolute security of the Greek royal family, surrounded by palaces, deference, and the sprawling network of European nobility. But this gilded cage was remarkably fragile. By the time her youngest brother Philip was born in 1921, the geopolitical landscape of Europe was fracturing. The catastrophic Greco-Turkish War ended in a humiliating and bloody defeat for Greece, triggering a violent military coup. Overnight, the sovereign rulers of Greece were transformed into hunted fugitives. Sophie's father, Prince Andrew, faced the very real threat of execution. The family was hastily evacuated by a British naval vessel, forced to flee their homeland with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the titles that suddenly meant nothing in a rapidly modernizing, hostile world. They arrived in France as high-born refugees, settling into a cramped borrowed home in the Parisian suburb of Saint-Cloud. For a young girl bred for palaces, the sudden plunge into exile and relative poverty was a profound psychological shock, planting the first deep seeds of a desperate need for security. The trauma of this exile completely broke the adults who were supposed to protect her, leaving Sophie and her sisters adrift in a terrifyingly vulnerable state. Her mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was a deeply sensitive woman who could not withstand the humiliating collapse of their lives. Alice sought refuge in severe religious fanaticism, eventually suffering a severe nervous breakdown. She began claiming she was receiving divine messages and was intimately communicating with Jesus Christ. In a deeply traumatic sequence of events orchestrated by her own family, Alice was forcibly removed from their home, heavily sedated, and committed to a grim psychiatric sanitarium in Switzerland under the care of a protégé of Sigmund Freud. She was subjected to horrific experimental treatments, effectively erasing her from her daughter's lives. In the wake of this domestic tragedy, rather than stepping up to anchor his shattered family, Prince Andrew completely abandoned his children. He fled to the French Riviera, choosing a life of hollow hedonism, gambling, and mistresses over the immense burden of raising 4 traumatized teenage daughters and a young son. Sophie, at a deeply formative age, was rendered an emotional orphan. She and her sisters were left entirely unprotected in an incredibly volatile Europe, possessing the prestigious bloodlines of Queen Victoria, but absolutely none of the financial or national security required to survive. It is within this profound vacuum of safety and parental guidance that the sinister allure of the German aristocracy presented itself as a miraculous salvation. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the old royal houses of Germany were also navigating the ashes of their own fallen empires, harboring a deep, venomous resentment toward the Weimar Republic and the looming threat of communism. They were actively seeking alliances that could restore their lost prestige. When a 16-year-old Sophie was introduced to Prince Christoph of Hesse, he did not appear as a harbinger of global destruction. He appeared as a magnificent savior. Christoph was undeniably handsome, incredibly wealthy, and boasted a lineage that stretched back to the most ancient German kings. He offered Sophie everything the Greek coup had stolen from her: a palace, immense wealth, impenetrable social standing, and, above all, the illusion of absolute safety. When they married in 1930, Sophie believed she had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of her ruined childhood to reclaim her rightful place in the world. However, the gilded fortress Christoph provided was built on a foundation of profound darkness. The House of Hesse, like many disillusioned German aristocratic families, had found a new, intoxicating religion to replace their lost monarchies, the rising tide of National Socialism. Taking Christoph's hand at the altar meant legally binding herself to the rapidly solidifying core of the Nazi elite. Christoph was an early and enthusiastic adapter to Adolf Hitler's vision, viewing the Nazi Party as the ultimate instrument to crush communism and restore German glory. He weaponized his aristocratic status, embedding himself entirely within the most terrifying apparatus of the state. Christoph joined the SS, eventually rising to the formidable rank of SS Oberfuhrer, a senior command position characterized by the infamous black uniform and the death's head insignia. Rather than recoiling from this radical militarization, Sophie seamlessly adapted to her new reality. The traumatized refugee from Saint-Cloud eagerly transformed herself into the ultimate high society Nazi hostess. Her private diaries, discovered decades later, shatter any defensive illusions that she was an ignorant, passive victim of her husband's politics. She documented her experiences hosting Adolf Hitler for private dinners at their estate, describing the architect of the coming genocide with glowing personal admiration, famously calling him a modest, charming man with beautiful blue eyes. She was entirely captivated by the power and order the regime projected, actively participating in the National Socialist Women's League and leveraging her vast network of European royal connections to act as a soft power diplomat for the Third Reich. When the inevitable global conflict erupted, the horrific reality of Sophie's choices manifested in a brutal fratricidal dynamic. Philip, fully adopting his British identity, became an officer in the Royal Navy, standing on the decks of destroyers in the Mediterranean, firing anti-aircraft guns at the very planes coordinated by the commanders his sister entertained at dinner parties. Sophie's world, meanwhile, remained deeply entrenched in the Nazi war machine. Christoph had transitioned to a critical role within the Luftwaffe, serving as a director in the Forschungsamt, Hermann Göring's highly secretive, omnipotent intelligence and wiretapping agency. Sophie was attending society weddings, sitting directly across from Hitler and socializing intimately with Emmy Göring, completely insulated in a bubble of fascist privilege while the continent burned. Yet as the war dragged on and the promise of a swift German victory evaporated in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front and the relentless Allied bombing campaigns, the atmosphere within the Hesse household grew paranoid and strained. The fanaticism that had once offered Sophie unparalleled security began to reveal itself as a death trap. By 1943, the tide of the war had irreversibly turned, and the illusion of the invincible thousand-year Reich was shattering. Christoph, possessing high-level intelligence clearance, was acutely aware of the impending catastrophic defeat and the horrific atrocities being committed in the name of the state he served. Whispers and historical analyses suggest that the SS Oberfuhrer grew deeply disillusioned and was potentially exploring incredibly dangerous avenues to quietly distance himself from the regime or even defect. But in the paranoid, blood-soaked environment of late-stage Nazi Germany, leaving the inner circle was impossible. On a foggy, treacherous day in October 1943, Christoph's military aircraft crashed into the rugged peaks of the Apennine Mountains in Italy under highly ambiguous circumstances. The sudden death of the intelligence chief immediately triggered intense suspicion. The Gestapo descended upon the Hesse household, aggressively interrogating a terrified Sophie. At 29 years old, the princess who had traded her soul for security was left utterly exposed, a widow stranded in a collapsing, hostile nation, surrounded by the terrifying gaze of the secret police, and burdened with 5 fatherless children, including a boy bearing the name of the man who was now dragging their world into total ruin. Inside a sunlit, immaculately appointed royal nursery, the air was fragrant with milk, lavender, and the undeniable scent of immense generational wealth. Here, a young princess of the bloodline of Queen Victoria gently rocked her newborn son to sleep. Now place that serene domestic tableau directly beside the suffocating, smoke-choked skies of a European continent being methodically prepared for unprecedented industrialized slaughter. A war machine actively fueled by the very men who sent silver rattles, congratulatory telegrams, and personally signed portraits to that exact same nursery. The world, gazing back through the unforgiving lens of history, would eventually look upon this mother with profound, unyielding revulsion, stripping her of her royal dignity and casting her into the historical abyss as an unrepentant collaborator, the ultimate betrayer of her family's honor. Yet, in the glittering, feverish, and profoundly paranoid atmosphere of high society Berlin in 1937, she was not a pariah. She was the radiant epicenter of a terrifying new aristocracy, receiving the highest, most coveted blessings of an absolute totalitarian state, exalted as a royal vessel securing the genetic legacy of the Third Reich. Why does this horrifying paradox exist, and how does a mother look into the innocent, unformed eyes of her infant and willingly, proudly brand his life with the name of a genocidal dictator? The architecture of the aristocratic trap ensnared the House of Hesse, and by extension Princess Sophie, through deep-seated resentments and terrifying ambitions. The marriage between Sophie and Prince Christoph was not merely a union of 2 displaced royals. It was a merger of deep-seated resentments and terrifying ambitions. To understand Christoph's fervent embrace of National Socialism, one must understand the profound psychological wound carried by the German nobility. The House of Hesse-Kassel had been brutally stripped of its sovereign power in vast territories by the expanding Prussian Empire in 1866. Decades later, the catastrophic defeat of World War I and the subsequent establishment of the Weimar Republic, a messy, chaotic, and decidedly non-royal democratic experiment, felt to these ancient families like a final, unbearable insult. They were princes without principalities, commanders without armies, living in vast, echoing castles while the country around them descended into hyperinflation and violent street battles between communists and fascists. When Adolf Hitler emerged from the political fringe, Hitler weaponized their resentment, feeding them a seductive, intoxicating language of absolute order, racial purity, and the restoration of a mythic, martial German glory. He offered the disenfranchised aristocracy a chance to be warriors and rulers once again. Prince Christoph did not merely survive within this new regime. He was an eager, proactive pioneer of its darkest mechanisms. Long before Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, Christoph had already seen the direction the wind was blowing. He officially joined the Nazi Party in 1931, an early adoption that proved he was not a reluctant latecomer forced into compliance, but a true believer. Furthermore, he joined the SS, the Schutzstaffel, in 1932. This was the black uniformed elite paramilitary corps of the party, a group explicitly designed to be the ideological and physical vanguard of Hitler's racial utopia. By aligning herself with Christoph, Sophie was not just marrying a man with right-wing political leanings. She was marrying into the most terrifying, ruthless brotherhood in Europe. The young refugee princess from Greece, who had spent her teenage years adrift in a modest Parisian suburb, suddenly found herself swept into a hypermasculine, deeply sinister world where power was absolute and brutality was celebrated as a virtue. The SS provided the ultimate impenetrable shield against the chaos that had destroyed her childhood. The reality of Christoph's daily life, which funded Sophie's opulent lifestyle, presents one of the most chilling contrasts of her narrative. Far removed from the grit of the front lines, Christoph operated strictly as a master of the shadows. As he rose through the ranks to become an SS Oberfuhrer, he was appointed as a director within the Forschungsamt, the highly secretive intelligence and cryptographic agency controlled directly by Hermann Göring. This was not a military intelligence unit fighting foreign enemies. The Forschungsamt was a massive industrialized wiretapping operation focused inward. Christoph's agency monitored the private telephone conversations of diplomats, military officials, everyday German citizens, and even rival Nazi party members. He was the chief eavesdropper of the Reich, a man whose daily routine involved gathering the invisible threads of paranoia and dissent that would eventually lead to arrests, torture, and executions by the Gestapo. While Sophie was managing a household of servants, selecting floral arrangements, and attending the opera, her husband was sitting in a secure facility in Berlin, listening to the terrified whispers of a nation turning in on itself. The blood money of the Nazi surveillance state purchased her silk dresses and funded the lavish dinner parties she threw at their estate. It was within this dizzying social whirlwind of the Nazi elite that Sophie's ideological seduction was completed. She was no longer just the sister of a minor Greek prince. She was the lady of the SS, a crucial social asset for a regime that desperately craved international legitimacy and aristocratic polish. The apex of this surreal existence occurred on April 10th, 1935, at the extravagant wedding of Hermann Göring to the actress Emmy Sonnemann. This event was designed to rival any royal wedding in British history. 30,000 troops lined the streets of Berlin, fighter planes roared overhead, and the ancient Berlin Cathedral was draped in massive swastika banners. At the incredibly exclusive reception, Princess Sophie of Hesse, born in the palaces of Corfu and bearing the blood of the British monarchy, was granted a seat of absolute honor. She was placed at the head table, sitting directly opposite Adolf Hitler himself. This was not a coincidental seating arrangement. It was a highly calculated display of power. The dictator was using her royal pedigree to legitimize his violent regime, and she was willingly, eagerly playing her part. Her private diaries from this period provide the most damning evidence against the post-war narrative that she was a naive, apolitical victim. When reflecting on her intimate dinners and social encounters with Hitler, she did not record feelings of dread, coercion, or moral compromise. Instead, she wrote with the breathless enthusiasm of a starstruck devotee. She described the man who was actively constructing the machinery of the Holocaust as a modest, charming man, explicitly praising his beautiful blue eyes and his captivating hypnotic presence. Hitler possessed a unique predatory ability to tailor his persona to his audience. To the roaring crowds at Nuremberg, he was a screaming demagogue. To the displaced, traumatized aristocrats sitting at a candlelit dinner table, he played the role of a quiet, respectful savior, an austere visionary who treated them with the deference they felt the modern world had violently stolen from them. Sophie swallowed this performance completely. She allowed the aesthetic of power, the crisp uniforms, the Wagnerian grandiosity, the absolute certainty of the Nazi vision to override any latent moral compass she might have possessed. This total psychological capitulation culminated in 1937, the year the illusion of an innocent aristocratic life was permanently shattered by a deliberate, profound act of biological devotion. Sophie became pregnant with her third child, her first son. In the patriarchal, militaristic culture of the SS, the birth of a male heir was an event of supreme ideological importance. It was the delivery of a future soldier for the Reich. When the boy was born, the naming process was not a matter of casual family tradition. They bypassed the ancient names of the Greek monarchy and the traditional British royal names. Instead, Christoph and Sophie chose the name Karl Adolf. To name a child after a sitting political leader is always a statement, but to name a royal child after Adolf Hitler in the heart of Nazi Germany was an act of complete public submission. It was a permanent flesh and blood declaration that the House of Hesse belonged entirely to the Führer. Hitler recognized the immense propaganda value of this aristocratic tribute. He did not merely send a standard congratulatory note. He engaged in a highly personal exchange, sending the family a large, silver-framed photograph of himself bearing a personal handwritten dedication to his infant namesake. This photograph was not tucked away in a drawer. It was prominently displayed in the Hesse household, a sinister talisman watching over the nursery of a boy whose uncle was, at that very moment, across the English Channel, preparing to dedicate his life to destroying everything that photograph stood for. While Karl Adolf was taking his first steps under the benevolent gaze of the dictator's portrait, Prince Philip was enduring the brutal character-forging winds of Gordonstoun School in Scotland under the tutelage of Kurt Hahn, a Jewish educator who had been imprisoned by the Nazis and forced to flee for his life. Hahn was actively teaching Philip the vital importance of moral courage, democratic responsibility, and the necessity of fighting tyranny. The timeline had split irreparably. Two siblings, born of the same traumatic exile, had chosen radically divergent paths of survival. One was being forged into the ultimate defender of the British realm. The other was swaddling her infant in the terrifying darkness of the swastika, sealing a family curse that the approaching firestorm of global war was about to rip mercilessly open. The declaration of war in September 1939 did not merely draw a geopolitical line across the map of Europe. It drove a brutal, iron wedge directly through the heart of the Battenberg-Hesse bloodline, transforming a family of displaced royals into active combatants locked in a fratricidal global conflict. The terrifying dichotomy of their existence, previously masked by the polite glittering veneer of international high society, was suddenly laid bare in the theater of total war. On one side of the English Channel stood Prince Philip, a young man who had internalized the lessons of his turbulent childhood by anchoring himself to the absolute discipline and democratic duty of his adopted British homeland. He did not seek refuge in neutral territories or leverage his royal connections to secure a safe, decorative desk job. Instead, Philip actively thrust himself into the vanguard of the Allied defense, commissioning as a midshipman in the Royal Navy. By 1940, he was stationed on the battleship HMS Ramillies, tasked with escorting vulnerable Australian expeditionary forces across the treacherous, submarine-infested waters of the Indian Ocean, before being transferred to the Mediterranean Fleet to face the full, unbridled fury of the Axis powers. Directly opposing him, firmly entrenched within the terrifying epicenter of the Nazi war machine, was his own sister. Sophie was no longer merely a passive aristocratic hostess. She was a senior matriarch within the SS elite, a woman whose husband held the keys to the Third Reich's domestic and international surveillance apparatus. As Philip stood on the bridge of the HMS Valiant during the ferocious Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941, operating the searchlights that illuminated Italian cruisers for destruction in the pitch-black Mediterranean night, earning a mention in dispatches for his undeniable bravery under fire, the chilling reality of the conflict cast a grotesque shadow over the Hesse household. The very aircraft dropping bombs on Philip's fleet and the bombers systematically obliterating the civilian centers of London, Coventry, and Plymouth during the Blitz belonged to the Luftwaffe. This was the same Luftwaffe commanded by Hermann Göring, the man whose extravagant wedding Sophie had attended as an honored guest and whose social circle she had so eagerly cultivated. Every time Philip's anti-aircraft batteries fired into the sky, they were firing at the military apparatus constructed and commanded by the men his sister invited to dinner. Within the opulent walls of the Hesse estates in Germany, the early years of the war were experienced through a lens of intoxicating, triumphant propaganda. The swift, brutal conquests of Poland, France, and the Low Countries seemed to validate the ruthless ideology that Christoph and Sophie had so fervently embraced. The SS, now at the height of its unchecked power, was not only the vanguard of the military conquest, but the primary architect of the Holocaust, orchestrating the systematic extermination of millions in the East. As a high-ranking director within the Forschungsamt, Prince Christoph was entirely insulated from the physical grime of the front lines, yet he was intimately, inextricably bound to the regime's darkest secrets. His intelligence agency monitored the communications that coordinated the movement of troops, the suppression of resistance movements across occupied Europe, and the logistical nightmares of the expanding concentration camp network. Christoph was a man who traded in the currency of whispers and state-sanctioned paranoia. He knew the unvarnished truth of the war, stripped of Joseph Goebbels' polished propaganda. He knew the exact horrifying cost of the empire his family was helping to build. However, the intoxicating illusion of an invincible thousand-year Reich was not destined to last. As the German military apparatus stalled in the frozen, blood-soaked mud of the Soviet Union, and as the immense industrial might of the United States entered the conflict, the suffocating reality of a multi-front war of attrition began to crack the facade of the Nazi elite. By late 1942 and early 1943, the skies over Germany, once the undisputed domain of Göring's Luftwaffe, were increasingly dominated by Allied bomber fleets. The terrifying wail of air raid sirens and the catastrophic destruction of German cities brought the war directly to Sophie's doorstep. The psychological toll of this shifting tide was profound, particularly for a woman who had traded her moral compass for the absolute guarantee of security. The impregnable fortress she believed she had secured through her marriage to the SS was now crumbling under the weight of high explosives and incendiary bombs. The elite social gatherings that had defined her existence in the 1930s were replaced by frantic evacuations, rationing, and the creeping, paralyzing realization that they were tethered to a regime that was dragging the entire nation into an apocalyptic abyss. For Prince Christoph, this realization appears to have manifested in a dangerous, fatal disillusionment. Historical consensus and the memoirs of the surviving Hesse family members suggest that by 1943, the SS Oberfuhrer had lost his faith in Adolf Hitler, the man who'd enthusiastically joined the Nazi Party before it even seized power, who had dedicated his life to the intelligence apparatus of the state, was now confronted with the catastrophic ruin of his country and the undeniable monstrous criminality of the SS. Christoph, utilizing his vast network of high-level contacts, allegedly began expressing defeatist sentiments, privately criticizing the disastrous military decisions of the Führer and the horrific excesses of the regime. In any normal society, such a change of heart might lead to a quiet resignation. But in the hyper-paranoid, cannibalistic environment of late-stage Nazi Germany, dissent, especially from a senior intelligence officer possessing intimate knowledge of the state's deepest secrets, was not merely frowned upon. It was an immediate, unforgivable death sentence. The Gestapo and the internal security forces of the SS, under the command of Heinrich Himmler, were ruthlessly purging anyone suspected of lacking absolute fanatical devotion to the dying Reich. On the fateful date of October 7, 1943, this simmering tension violently erupted into tragedy. Prince Christoph of Hesse boarded a military aircraft departing from an airfield in Italy, ostensibly on a routine mission. The aircraft never reached its destination. It plummeted into the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Apennine Mountains, killing Christoph instantly at the age of 42. Almost immediately, the circumstances surrounding the crash were shrouded in a dense, impenetrable fog of suspicion and fear. While the official state narrative hastily categorized the incident as a tragic aviation accident caused by poor weather or enemy fire, the reality within the terrified aristocratic circles of Germany was vastly different. Given Christoph's recent ideological wavering, his high-level security clearance, and the notoriously ruthless methods of the regime he served, a chilling consensus formed. The intelligence chief had been assassinated by his own government. The belief was that the aircraft had been deliberately sabotaged by the Gestapo or the SS to silence a high-profile potential defector before he could orchestrate a betrayal. The immediate aftermath of Christoph's violent death shattered the final illusions of Sophie's Nazi sanctuary. She was not granted the dignified, respectful mourning period typical for the widow of a fallen war hero. Instead, she was immediately thrust into a terrifying Kafkaesque nightmare. Within days of the crash, the secret police descended upon her home. The Gestapo, treating the grieving widow not as a royal asset but as a potential enemy of the state, subjected Sophie to grueling, hostile interrogations. They aggressively searched her residence, seizing Christoph's private papers, diaries, and any documentation that might prove his disloyalty to the Führer. The very security apparatus that she had relied upon for over a decade, the men who had attended her dinner parties and celebrated the birth of her son Karl Adolf, were now treating her as a hostile suspect. At exactly 29 years old, Sophie was violently stripped of her power and protection. She was left entirely alone in a collapsing paranoid empire, responsible for the survival of 5 young children. The aristocratic safety net she had so desperately sought after the trauma of her exile from Greece had proven to be a fatal trap. She was now a widow of a suspected traitor in a regime that was rapidly losing its grip on reality, surrounded by a populace facing starvation and total defeat. While her brother Philip was sailing toward the eventual victory of the Allied forces, forging a future defined by honor and public service, Sophie was trapped in the ruins of her own catastrophic choices, bracing for the inevitable, devastating arrival of the victorious armies who would look upon her life, her husband, and the name of her son, not with royal deference, but with absolute righteous condemnation. The freezing winter of 1943 descended upon the collapsing Third Reich not merely as a shift in season, but as a suffocating shroud of apocalyptic dread, enveloping a nation that was systematically being reduced to ash and rubble by relentless Allied bombardment. For Princess Sophie, this winter marked the absolute nadir of her terrifying descent from the glittering heights of Nazi aristocracy into a state of paralyzed, claustrophobic terror. Following the deeply suspicious death of Prince Christoph in the Apennine Mountains, she was no longer the exalted lady of the SS, the honored guest seated across from the Führer, or the untouchable sister of a British naval hero. She was a deeply suspect widow, pregnant with her fifth child, trapped within the heavily monitored confines of the Hesse estates, and forced to navigate a daily existence shadowed by the omnipresent, menacing gaze of the Gestapo. The very intelligence apparatus her husband had helped to construct, the vast machinery of state-sanctioned paranoia that had once guaranteed her absolute privilege, was now turned violently inward, scrutinizing her every word, her every correspondence, and her every association for any trace of the treason they believed had infected Christoph's final days. In February 1944, amidst the wailing of air raid sirens and the catastrophic destruction of the German infrastructure, Sophie gave birth to a daughter, Clarissa, the birth of a royal child, an event that just 7 years prior had been heralded with personally signed portraits from Adolf Hitler and the terrifying pomp of the SS elite, was now a profoundly isolating, terrifying ordeal. There were no grand celebrations, no state-sponsored congratulatory telegrams, and certainly no illusions about the world this child was entering. The nursery, once a symbol of the regime's supreme confidence in its thousand-year destiny, was now a fragile sanctuary in a nation marching inexorably toward total annihilation. Sophie was forced to become the sole protector of 5 children: Christina, Dorothea, Karl Adolf, Rainer, and the newborn Clarissa, in an environment where the basic necessities of life were vanishing, and where the aristocratic titles that had defined her entire existence offered absolutely no protection against high explosives or the fanatical purges of a dying, desperate regime. The terrifying irony of her situation was inescapable. The political marriage she had forged to escape the humiliating poverty and instability of her refugee youth had successfully delivered her directly into the epicenter of the most destructive military collapse in human history. As the Soviet Red Army relentlessly ground its way toward Berlin from the east, leaving a trail of unprecedented vengeance and devastation in its wake, and as the American and British forces breached the western borders of the Reich, the psychological landscape of the German nobility fractured entirely. The grand illusions of a restored, racially pure aristocracy, the Wagnerian fantasies that had seduced the House of Hesse and so many others, evaporated into the choking dust of ruined cities. Sophie, bearing the heavy, inescapable burden of a son, named after the man orchestrating this continental suicide, found herself caught in a terrifying historical vice. She could not flee to the west, for she was undeniably bound to the senior command structure of the enemy. She could not remain safely in the east, for the advancing Soviets viewed the German aristocracy, particularly those with SS affiliations, with absolute murderous contempt. The survival of the Hesse children depended entirely on Sophie's ability to navigate the chaotic, blood-soaked twilight of the Nazi state, shedding the arrogant grandeur of her past to become a desperate, invisible mother trying to outrun an apocalyptic reckoning. The ultimate collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 did not usher in a period of peaceful liberation for the remnants of the German aristocracy. It initiated a brutal, blinding exposure to the true magnitude of the horrors they had actively supported, enabled, and legitimized. As the Allied forces liberated the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau, the staggering, industrialized scale of the Holocaust was broadcast to a horrified world. The men who had orchestrated this unprecedented genocide were the very same men who had attended Sophie's dinner parties, the men who had posed for photographs at high society weddings, and the men who had commanded her husband. The name Adolf, which Sophie had so proudly bestowed upon her firstborn son as a symbol of aristocratic devotion, instantly became the most toxic, universally reviled name in human history, a permanent linguistic brand of absolute evil. There was no longer any possibility of retreating behind the polite, historical fiction of naive political entanglement. The world now knew exactly what the SS uniform represented, and Sophie had spent the entire decade proudly standing beside it. In stark, devastating contrast to Sophie's catastrophic ruin, the end of the Second World War elevated her youngest brother, Prince Philip, to the absolute zenith of global heroism and imperial prestige. Philip had not spent the war hiding in neutral territories. He had actively participated in the destruction of the Axis powers. By the time the Empire of Japan formally surrendered in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, Philip was a deeply respected, battle-hardened officer in the Royal Navy, possessing an impeccable military record completely devoid of the fascist stain that had ruined his sisters. He was the golden boy of the ambitious Mountbatten family, a handsome, dynamic war hero perfectly positioned to revitalize the battered but victorious British monarchy. While Sophie was navigating the humiliated, occupied ruins of Germany, undergoing the intense, humiliating scrutiny of the Allied denazification tribunals, which sought to systematically root out and punish those who had collaborated with the regime, Philip was returning to London to a hero's welcome, embarking on a carefully orchestrated high-stakes romance with Princess Elizabeth, the beloved heir presumptive to the throne of the British Empire. The profound divergence of their destinies created an agonizing, unbridgeable chasm within the Battenberg-Hesse bloodline. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had steered the United Kingdom through the terrifying trauma of the Blitz, enduring the relentless Luftwaffe bombings that had destroyed massive swaths of London and claimed tens of thousands of British lives. They harbored a deep, visceral, and entirely justified animosity toward anything German. The British public, still rationing basic foodstuffs and mourning an entire generation of young men lost on the battlefields of Europe, shared this intense, uncompromising hatred for the former enemy. As the romantic relationship between Philip and Elizabeth blossomed into a formal engagement in 1947, the geopolitical reality of Philip's familial connections transformed from a private tragedy into a massive, highly explosive constitutional crisis. The Mountbatten family, led by the fiercely ambitious Lord Louis Mountbatten, executed a brilliant, ruthless campaign to thoroughly anglicize Philip, legally stripping him of his Greek and Danish royal titles, neutralizing his foreign surname, and officially rebranding him as Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, a purely British subject and a devoted servant of the crown. However, no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the biological reality of his 4 sisters. The British government and the highest echelons of Buckingham Palace recognized immediately that the presence of the German sisters at the upcoming royal wedding would constitute a public relations catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. It was politically impossible and deeply offensive to the British public to expect the victims of the Blitz to tolerate the sight of women who had been married to senior SS officers and high-ranking Nazi officials standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The memory of the war was too raw, the graves were too fresh, and the undeniable photographic evidence of Sophie dining with Adolf Hitler was a diplomatic landmine that the palace was entirely unwilling to step on. The Crown demanded a flawless, unified narrative of British resilience and moral victory. There was absolutely no room within that narrative for the messy, treasonous reality of the Nazi sister. The decree that descended from the highest authorities in London was absolute, chillingly pragmatic, and utterly devoid of any familial sentiment or mercy. Philip was to sever all public ties with his sisters. None of them, regardless of their individual circumstances or the specific nature of their wartime survival, would be permitted to attend the royal wedding at Westminster Abbey. For Sophie, this devastating decree was the final fatal blow of the dynastic curse that had defined her entire life. She had originally married into the darkest regime of the 20th century in a desperate, traumatized attempt to secure her status and protect her family from the humiliations of exile. She had sacrificed her moral integrity to guarantee her place within the royal pantheon. Yet when the dust of the global conflict finally settled, the very institution of royalty that she had fought so fiercely to remain a part of looked upon her not with the grace of familial forgiveness, but with the cold, calculating eyes of self-preservation, and unceremoniously erased her from history. As the world prepared to celebrate the union of Philip and Elizabeth as a glorious new dawn for the post-war era, Sophie was condemned to remain in the shadows of a shattered Germany, a permanent exile, utterly alone with the terrifying ghosts of her past, and a son whose very name was a constant agonizing reminder of the price she had paid for a crown that was never truly hers. She is a figure left to rot in the smoldering radioactive ashes of a condemned and defeated nation, branded by the victorious world as a willing, unrepentant accomplice to a regime responsible for the industrialized slaughter of millions, her very existence synonymous with the darkest, most terrifying chapter of human depravity. Standing in magnificent, blinding contrast is the glittering spectacle of a royal victor, draped in the ancient, sacred honors of the British Empire, cheered by millions of adoring subjects as he solemnly secures a bloodline that will reign unchallenged over a modern age, his chest heavy with the medals of righteous valor. They are not strangers divided by the vast, chaotic sweep of a brutal century, but siblings forged in the exact same cradle of traumatic aristocratic exile. Prince Philip, the venerated Duke of Edinburgh, and Princess Sophie, the disgraced, heavily scrutinized Lady of Hesse. How does the exact same royal blood that pumped so faithfully through the heart of the world's most beloved constitutional monarchy also nourish the blind fanaticism of a mother who surrendered her soul to fascism, leaving us to wonder if the truest, most inescapable curse of dynastic power is its terrifying capacity to simultaneously forge both the ultimate savior and the ultimate monster? The terrifying reality of the post-war era for Princess Sophie was not merely an abstract political defeat. It was a deeply personal, physically devastating collapse of the entire aristocratic universe she had sacrificed her moral integrity to construct. In the immediate chaotic aftermath of the unconditional German surrender in May 1945, the sprawling, magnificent estates of the House of Hesse, which had once hosted the highest echelons of the Nazi elite, were abruptly transformed into sites of humiliating occupation. Friedrichshof Castle, the grand neo-Gothic palace built by her great-aunt Victoria, Princess Royal, was summarily commandeered by the advancing American military forces, requisitioned to serve as an opulent officers' club for the victorious conquerors. Sophie, stripped of her protective SS network and her royal deference, found herself violently downgraded from a powerful hostess of the Third Reich to an impoverished, highly suspicious widow, navigating a landscape of absolute ruin. The grand drawing rooms where she had once poured tea for Adolf Hitler were now filled with the jazz music and cigarette smoke of American GIs, a jarring, inescapable daily reminder of her total catastrophic miscalculation. This period of occupation introduced a new layer of chaotic humiliation that perfectly encapsulated the complete loss of control experienced by the defeated German nobility. As the American military established its presence within the Hesse properties, a sensational and highly destructive crime unfolded right beneath the noses of the occupying forces, further devastating the family's fractured legacy. In a brazen act of wartime looting, several American officers stationed at Friedrichshof discovered the hidden cache of the immensely valuable Hesse crown jewels, a breathtaking collection of diamonds, rubies, and ancient royal heirlooms that the family had desperately buried in the castle's cellar to protect them from the relentless Allied bombing campaigns. These officers, intoxicated by the spoils of war and viewing the German aristocracy with absolute justified contempt, systematically looted the priceless treasure, smuggling the jewels out of the country and selling them on the black market. For Sophie and her extended family, the theft of their ancestral wealth was not merely a financial catastrophe. It was the ultimate, deeply symbolic violation. The physical manifestations of their ancient royal continuity, the glittering stones that had defined their prestige for centuries, were casually stolen by the very forces that were currently scrutinizing their complicity in the Holocaust. Surviving in this landscape of total deprivation and intense suspicion required a complete psychological compartmentalization. Sophie, burdened with the immense responsibility of raising 5 young children in a country where basic food rations were scarce and the winter cold was lethal, could no longer afford the luxury of ideological fanaticism. The sheer, overwhelming machinery of the Allied denazification process was aggressively sweeping through the remnants of the German elite, seeking to systematically identify, categorize, and punish those who had actively sustained the Hitler regime. Because her late husband, Prince Christoph, had been a senior SS Oberfuhrer and a director within Hermann Göring's intelligence apparatus, Sophie was subjected to grueling, terrifying interrogations. She was forced to desperately downplay her profound involvement with the National Socialist Women's League and her intimate social connections to the highest-ranking war criminals. Retro, actively framing her past not as a period of enthusiastic, willing participation, but as a naive, helpless capitulation to a terrifying dictatorship. She had to actively obscure the horrifying reality that she had proudly named her son Karl Adolf, transforming the once exalted tribute into a terrifying liability that threatened to mark her children as permanent pariahs in the new democratic Europe. In a desperate, calculated bid to restore some semblance of aristocratic normalcy and emotional security amidst the ruins, Sophie made a deeply pragmatic choice in 1946. She married Prince George William of Hanover, a man who, like her, belonged to the shattered remnants of the German nobility. This union was not the glittering, highly publicized geopolitical alliance of her first marriage. It was a quiet, almost defensive consolidation of two broken royal bloodlines, an attempt to build a small, insulated sanctuary against the harsh, unforgiving glare of the post-war world. Prince George William had also served in the German military, though his record lacked the terrifying, deeply sinister SS affiliations that had doomed Christoph. Together, they retreated to the quiet provincial town of Salem in southern Germany, heavily relying on the support of the extended royal network to slowly rebuild a deeply private, distinctly unimperial life. Yet this new marriage, while providing a crucial domestic anchor, could not shield her from the ultimate agonizing emotional blow that was currently being orchestrated across the English Channel. The year 1947 arrived not with the promise of familial reconciliation, but with the cold, absolute execution of a dynastic purge. The British Empire, exhausted and heavily indebted from the immense cost of defeating fascism, desperately required a massive, unifying spectacle of hope and continuity. The impending marriage of Princess Elizabeth to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten was precisely the glittering, fairy tale narrative the British government and the besieged House of Windsor needed to project strength and secure the future of the monarchy. However, the architects of this royal triumph, King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and the fiercely strategic Lord Mountbatten, were acutely, terrifyingly aware of the radioactive political liability posed by Philip's blood relations. The British public, still mourning the tens of thousands of civilians obliterated by the Luftwaffe and the soldiers slaughtered on the beaches of Normandy, would never tolerate the presence of German royals who had spent the war embedded within the Nazi elite. The directive issued from Buckingham Palace was swift, unequivocal, and brutally effective. A total, impenetrable iron curtain was to be drawn between the groom and his sisters. When the magnificent, globally broadcast wedding day arrived in November 1947, the contrast between the two siblings reached its absolute heartbreaking zenith. Inside the soaring ancient arches of Westminster Abbey, surrounded by the triumphant monarchs of Europe, the highest political dignitaries of the Allied powers, and a rapturous, adoring British public, Philip stood at the altar, securing his permanent place in the pantheon of global history. He was the immaculate hero, the savior of the Mountbatten name, embarking on a life of unimaginable privilege, global influence, and unshakable public reverence. Simultaneously, in the quiet, defeated shadows of a ruined Germany, Sophie sat entirely excluded, deliberately erased from the defining triumph of her own family. She was not permitted a seat in the pews. She was not allowed a place on the balcony. She was not even acknowledged in the official narrative of the day. The Crown had calculated that her presence would permanently taint the sacred aura of the new royal era, and therefore she was ruthlessly excised, sacrificed upon the altar of dynastic public relations. This devastating snub cemented Sophie's permanent exile from the inner circle of the British royal family, forcing her to confront the agonizing reality that the very institution of monarchy she had always revered prioritizes its own survival above all biological bonds. She spent the subsequent decades living a life of profound enforced obscurity, a phantom princess haunting the quiet corners of Bavaria. The world rapidly moved on, plunging into the deep freeze of the Cold War and the dizzying acceleration of the modern age. But Sophie remained permanently anchored to the catastrophic choices of her youth. As her brother Philip traveled the globe, shaping the modern Commonwealth and standing as the steadfast patriarch of the House of Windsor, Sophie raised her children in the complex, heavily burdened atmosphere of post-war Germany, carrying the incredibly heavy, unspoken shame of the Nazi sister label. The name Karl Adolf, once a proud, gleaming tribute to absolute power, became a quiet, enduring scar, a constant daily reminder of the terrifying ideological blindness that had consumed her family. In her twilight years, as the immediate, visceral hatred of the war began to slowly fade into the detached analysis of history, Sophie finally attempted to reclaim a fragment of her own narrative. In a privately circulated memoir, she offered a deeply sanitized, highly defensive rationalization of her descent into fascism. She reiterated her claim that Adolf Hitler had presented himself as a modest, charming man, arguing that the German aristocracy had been seduced by a carefully constructed illusion of order and respectability, entirely ignorant of the monstrous genocidal reality churning beneath the surface. However, this late-stage defense rings hollow when confronted with the undeniable historical record of her husband's senior intelligence role, the intimate dinners with the architects of the Holocaust, and the explicit biological devotion demonstrated in the naming of her son. The memoir reads less as a genuine historical reckoning and more as the desperate plea of an elderly woman terrified of being remembered solely as a monster, an attempt to bridge the unbridgeable gap between the innocent refugee princess of Corfu and the willing accomplice of the SS. When Princess Sophie died in Munich in November 2001, at the advanced age of 87, her passing barely registered on the global consciousness. There were no state funerals, no flags flown at half-mast across the Commonwealth, and no grand public eulogies delivered from the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. She slipped away quietly, an elderly woman who had outlived the empire that exiled her, the regime that seduced her, and the husband who had tied her to the darkest chapter in human history. Her death was the silent conclusion of a life defined by spectacular, terrifying extremes, from the sun-drenched palaces of the Greek monarchy to the squalid exile of Paris, from the dizzying, blood-soaked heights of the Nazi elite to the permanent, humiliating obscurity of a defeated Germany. She died as she had lived her final 50 years, a carefully managed secret, a cautionary tale confined to the footnotes of royal biographies, her complex humanity entirely subsumed by the unforgiving singular label of the Nazi sister. The profound, agonizing irony of her life was definitively illuminated exactly 2 decades after her death, during the funeral of Prince Philip in April 2021. The Duke of Edinburgh's funeral was a stark, severely scaled-back ceremony constrained by the global pandemic. The guest list was ruthlessly restricted to a mere 30 people, a fraction of the thousands who would typically attend the funeral of a monarch's consort. Queen Elizabeth, sitting completely alone in the choir of St. George's Chapel, had to make agonizing decisions about who would be permitted to stand inside those ancient walls. In a final undeniable vindication of the bloodline that had been so aggressively purged in 1947, the guest list included 3 of Philip's German relatives, representatives of the very Hesse and Hohenlohe-Langenburg families that had been explicitly banned from his wedding. The presence of these German princes, walking behind his coffin on the grounds of Windsor Castle, was a quiet, monumental closing of the historical circle. It was Philip's final, posthumous insistence that his family, despite the horrifying, unforgivable choices of the past, was finally permitted to stand in the light. Princess Sophie's tragic narrative stands as a brutal, unvarnished indictment of the royal condition itself. Her story is not simply a biography of a flawed woman. It is a brutal, unvarnished indictment of the royal condition. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the institution of monarchy is at its core a survival mechanism that ruthlessly strips away human morality in favor of dynastic preservation. The same desperate instinct that drove Sophie to seek the violent, absolute protection of the SS in 1930 was the exact same instinct that drove the British Crown to ruthlessly erase her from existence in 1947. Both actions were born from a primal terror of annihilation. Sophie believed the swastika would save her from the poverty of exile. The House of Windsor believed that erasing Sophie would save them from the wrath of a post-war public. The tragedy of the SS sister is the realization that in the high-stakes, ruthless game of royal survival, there are no pure victims and no immaculate heroes. There are only those who successfully manage the narrative and those who are buried by it. Sophie's legacy is a permanent, haunting reflection of the fragility of the human compass when subjected to the terrifying pressures of geopolitical collapse. She was a mother who looked at the architect of the Holocaust and saw a savior, a princess who traded her honor for a palace built on ashes. She represents the terrifying capacity of the privileged class to normalize absolute evil as long as it guarantees their own status. Yet to dismiss her simply as a monster is to ignore the profound traumatic forces that forged her. She was a child of ruin, abandoned by her parents and left to navigate a continent descending into madness. Her catastrophic failure was not born of inherent malice, but of a desperate, blinding hunger for a security that ultimately devoured her entirely. The grave of Princess Sophie of Hesse in the quiet earth of Germany marks the end of one woman's devastating journey through the darkest century in human history, but it does not mark the end of the bloodline's complicity. The story of the Battenberg sisters is a hydra of royal tragedy, and Sophie was merely one head. The narrative we have unspooled of SS intelligence chiefs, intimate dinners with dictators, and the profound, brutal erasure by the British Crown is only a fragment of the terrifying reality that consumed the family of Prince Philip. To truly understand the depth of this dynastic curse, one must look beyond the quiet exile of Sophie and turn toward the sky. There is another sister, Princess Cecilia, whose descent into the Nazi elite was arguably even more fervent, and whose ultimate violent end remains one of the most shocking, macabre, and heavily censored tragedies in the history of the European aristocracy. She did not survive to face the quiet humiliation of the post-war world. Her devotion to the swastika culminated in a catastrophic fiery plunge that wiped out her entire family in a single devastating instant, leaving behind a horrific mystery that historians are still struggling to untangle. The House of Windsor survived the Second World War by burying its secrets deep beneath the floorboards of Buckingham Palace. But blood eventually always seeps through. The true, unparalleled horror of the royal family's Nazi connection has not yet been fully exposed.